Day two with a brief history here. So we're going to look at the answer to the question, how did Latinos get here? And for the most part, we have to look first at the Spanish-American War. At the end of that war, the United States gets these areas as well as some entitlement to Cuba, as well as Puerto Rico. Keep in mind that there is a close proximity to the United States just for defensive reasons. And you're going to see that the relationship between Puerto Ricans and Cuba, Puerto Rican in the United States or Cuba in the United States is different based on some of these particular factors. One in case the proximity. Mexican-American War in the 1800s, there was a war called the Mexican-American War, and at the end of that conflict, Mexico ceded to the United States areas that are now presently part of the United States. This image here is looking at the Mexican Repatriation Act, where during the 1920s, when the Depression's about to start, you start to see this move to try to send Mexicans back. 4 trucks carry Lamar County Mexicans to Denver today. Trainload of Mexicans will leave for home tonight. Here we see another one, the Mexican repatriation of Mexicans here. This is June of 1926. So these are New York Times articles that are advocating or addressing the decision to send Mexicans back to Mexico. And we see this statistic here that they determined that 200,000 Mexicans now live in American cities. So the idea of quotas and deportation of people primarily from Mexico, definitely an issue going back to the 1920s. Now, when we go back here with Puerto Rico, so for Puerto Ricans, they have what's known as the revolving door. Puerto Ricans are able to travel freely. But Puerto Rican migration seems to be in big cities like Chicago, New York City, South Bronx. Cubans would primarily go to Florida, and that is a result of the Cold War and United States tensions with Cuba, which leads to a situation where any Cuban that is able to get to the United States on U.S. soil can come in and claim as a political refugee. So methods of getting into the United States vary depending on the group we are talking about. So here we see Mexican deportation held up by an injunction. Deportation positions are too drastic, so we see some criticism. 35,000 Mexicans are leaving California. What's the date here? Looks like 1931. Here we see some images from the Mexican Repatriation Act, where again, Mexicans were sent back. Here we see 2006, there was an apology that was issued for the Mexican Repatriation Act. World War II, we see the Bracero Program. So in World War II, I use this image because we're trying to encourage. Why? Because we know that there is a war going on, and a lot of the labor hands, the males, are going off to fight the Nazis. And so you need a labor force. So the Bracero Program, now we're going to encourage migration. World War I, we encouraged, and the Bracero Program, we discouraged migration. Again, we're talking primarily about people from Mexico. Here we see this program, fill the labor shortage in agriculture, last 22 years. Here we see contracts. Just a side note, I know Cesar Chavez would come to his family would come to the United States as part of that. So now we're looking at migration primarily to California, and we see terms here, Chicano and the Pachuco. The Chicano is the newly arrived Mexican immigrant, probably has no real connection to the United States, probably has more of a connection to what it means to be a Mexican from Mexico, and the Pachuco is a U.S.-born Mexican youth. So these individuals are born here in the United States, whereas these individuals are from Mexico. So why are these terms important? They're important because their view is going to determine whether or not they are viewing themselves as Mexican-American or an American Mexican. There is a difference, depending on which one is first, determines which one you probably have more of an allegiance to, and also about the question of assimilation. So the next item up, we see tension among the Californians, the Chicano and the Pachuco, and we see what becomes known as the Sleepy Lagoon case that will be addressed in a later screencast that will be entirely about the Zoot Suit riots. And so we see the murder of Jose Diaz as a call to action. They're starting to round up 600 youths. We see this particular trial dominating the headlines. And we see the conflict that takes place in World War II that may or may not have contributed to the Zoot Suit riots, primarily from the perspective of a lack of patriotism. That is still to be determined. Here we see the people hauled into court for the Sleepy Lagoon case. The Zoot Suit, which is this particular clothing piece, notice the longer jacket. And if we were looking at the pants would kind of taper off to the bottom, and then you'd see the foot. So here we'd see the tapered, and we'd see the foot here. And so the issue here is that the Mexican youth seem to be wearing this particular item. So why is that significant? It is significant because the government during World War II rationed certain fabrics. So the issue here is that Mexican youths are wearing this. The fabric is rationed for the war effort. And the question here is whether or not the Mexicans are targeted because of their ethnicity or because of their lack of patriotism. So in the Zoot Suit riots, we see the stripping of the Zoot Suit from Mexican youths. And the argument is that this is really done because of a lack of patriotism, which is why we went over the terms up here. Or sorry, the ones up here with the Pachuco and the Chicano. So that is a debate question. Zoot Suit riot headline. Here we see the cover of a book. We probably will watch some of this documentary. I've already addressed Cubans in the Cold War. Helps it easier to make Cuban citizens escape Cuba and get permanent residence in the United States. So Cubans are dealt with differently than the Mexicans as opposed to the Puerto Ricans, and so on. And so here we see yet another policy. Anyone who fled Cuba entered the U.S. will be allowed to pursue residency a year later. And if you know anything about the relationship between the United States and Cuba during the Cold War, Castro decided, well, if that's your policy, I will just release some of the criminals and degenerates I have in Cuba, and they will make it to the United States. And because of the United States policy, they will become U.S. residents. So he pretty much unloaded all of his undesirables. And in Cuba, you also have, in Florida, a significant high amount of Cubans that live there. And if we know that particular policy, the story of Elian Gonzalez, this boy here, where he had traveled to the United States, his parents were divorced, and his mother, did not make it. She dies in the crossing, and Elian Gonzalez, the little boy, makes it to the United States. So if we have the United States here, and we have Cuba here, him and his mom flee. She doesn't make it, but now the boy is here. Does he now qualify for any of these policies? And the end result is that the father in Cuba wanted to have his son returned, and this resulted in a U.S.-Cuban relationship disaster. We're now going to transition to the episode of 30 Days, and we'll look at some of the Minutemen on the borders trying to defend the borders from illegal migration to the United States.